are out there. Also, when you're thinking about the planning effort, it's a good time to start thinking about, what opportunities might there be for conservation, and are the enabling conditions there? I mean, there's instances, and certainly in the Nature Conservancy and other conservation organizations, where we're thinking about launching a conservation initiative, and after you do a sort of careful analysis about are the enabling conditions in place, you actually make a decision that maybe this isn't quite the right time to launch an initiative. The conditions for it just aren't right. And then lastly, there's quite a few tools, and I'll touch on one of those. There's tools to help people think about the situation analysis, and one of those tools is conceptual models. There's software like Marathi that are out there to help you develop a conceptual model. Now, this is just a quick graphic of what a socioeconomic system might look like. This is not rocket science, I'm sure, for any of you, but you've got some resources that you care about, biological resources, maybe socioeconomic resources. You've got systems that you're already working with. There's probably an existing protected area or existing conservation areas. There are governance systems of various kinds that probably already exist. And then there are various users, and the interactions among those different components are what a lot of people broadly refer to as a socioeconomic system. Threat assessments. Lots of different ways to do threat assessments. This happens to be an example of a threat assessment that was done for a landscape in South Australia. And many of you may be familiar with the organization Greening Australia. They do a lot of conservation planning across Australia. They do a lot of threat assessments. So in this particular assessment, it's largely driven by experts, and up across the x-axis, you're looking at different conservation features that people want to conserve, and down the y-axis are different threats to those features, and then the colored blocks are sort of expert judgments on the level of threat, and it helps you think about what some of the most important threats are, and how in that management plan you're going to need to respond to those threats. I mentioned tools. Conceptual models is one way to convey the situation that's out there. This is a conceptual model for a large conservation initiative in central Kenya called the Northern Rangelands Trust. And oftentimes these conceptual models will look something like this, where you've got sort of the things, if you will, like rangelands and wildlife and livelihoods that you want to conserve on the right, some of the direct threats to them just to the left of that, and then further to the left, some indirect threats and some broad strategies that you're seeing in the more diamond-shaped polygons that are up there, sort of different broad strategies for addressing some of these threats. So that's just what a conceptual model might look like. There's lots of different ways to do conceptual models, but it's a way to portray what the situation is. Now, the last topic I wanted to touch on is really about establishing goals, objectives, outcomes. There's a lot of different terminology that people use. I don't want to get caught up in that terminology here. It can get confusing. But what we do want to talk a little bit about is sort of the longer term picture of what you're trying to achieve, what a lot of people call fundamental outcomes, ultimate outcomes, versus sort of nearer term outcomes. Some people refer to those as intermediate objectives, intermediate outcomes. And we also want to make sure we talk about the importance of differentiating between means and ends. You see a couple of pictures here where, the end is definitely about that fundamental outcome. In this case, a particular ecosystem being managed in a particular way in the picture on the right. The means in this case, this happens to be some pictures from the southeastern United States where they're very fire-dependent ecosystems. And so, prescribed fire and fire being managed is a means to get to an end here. So fundamental outcomes. These are, the long-term things that we're trying to get done. They really represent what we care about. Science can inform that, but a lot of it is really value driven. It's what, for a particular protected area or conservation area, we really want to get done over the long term. So science and values can help define those, and those fundamental values, they ought to guide the kind of strategies and actions we come up with, because we're trying to think about what are we going to get done in the long term. They tend to have two components to these sort of outcome statements. They're the things, if you will, that we care about. Oftentimes that's biodiversity, but it could be livelihoods, it could be tourism, and sort of the direction we want those to go. So here's a couple, these are examples from some real conservation and management plans for protected areas. There's one from Kruger: secure and strengthen the future of any red list species in Kruger National Park. Well, that's a long-term fundamental outcome, to secure the future for a particular group of species. The second one comes from a park here in Australia. It's about securing the integrity of internationally significant beach ecosystems in Lamington National Park. And the third one comes from a wildlife refuge in the United States, about maintaining healthy elk and bison populations that can adapt to changing environments. So those are those long-term fundamental outcomes that we're looking for in a protected area. And just to differentiate those from sort of more near-term outcomes that we're going to focus on. So this again is that conservation initiative in central Kenya, the Northern Rangelands Trust. And you see on the right what some of the fundamental long-term outcomes might look like about government structures and incomes and rangeland condition. And on the left then are more near-term goals that you can build a work plan around, of establishing grazing committees that are going to help form that governance structure, of doing certain things about livelihoods and increasing livelihoods at a certain level, and access to income and markets within a certain time period. So the point is that these more intermediate incomes are going to drive work plans, but you need to keep the longer term fundamental outcomes in sight. So just quickly, my summary here for what I've had to present, I just wanted to hit on a few key points. That thinking about that internal context, a lot of people overlook that, and it's really critical in terms of whether a management plan for a protected area is going to be successful. If you think about things like, who's going to make decisions? What decisions are they going to make? Why are we doing this plan? The second point is, in terms of planning in general for management plans and protected areas, is that they don't all require the same investment in planning. And there are tools out there to help you think through how much to invest. Conceptual models we talked about for situation analyses can be really helpful tools used at the beginning of a planning effort to sort of think through a number of different aspects of the conservation plan. Need to always keep in mind that distinction between ends and means, and then focus on both fundamental outcomes for the long-term big picture and more near-term intermediate outcomes for work planning for the 2 to 3 years ahead. So that's a quick summary of some of the points that I wanted to make, and our next speaker is going to be Morena Mills, who's going to talk some about stakeholder analyses.